First of all, thank you, welcome. My name is Tom. I'm a second year student of computer science. I do a bunch of things around here. I'm a tutor. I'm the software projects director for CSESoc. I don't know what else I do, but I do a lot of things. I am actually not a veteran Vue.js person. I came across it 6 months ago in the course of looking for a way to get around the fact that JavaScript is awful. But Vue.js solves all the problems that I had with JavaScript, and I am now a massive fan of it. And I'd like to basically share the story of how I became a fan of Vue.js and show you how you can get into it and why it's so awesome. Cool, so what am I assuming for this talk? I'm hoping that people know how the very, very basics of the web, so what is HTML and what is JavaScript. Even if you don't know what JavaScript is, I wouldn't worry. It looks very similar to any other programming language that you've seen, like C or like Python, particularly Python. And hopefully, even if you don't know the specifics of the language, you'll be able to follow along with why Vue is so powerful and so useful. The other thing is that this is not going to be a course in designing beautiful websites that look amazing, because that's not my area of expertise. This is a course in designing websites quickly that are really functional and useful. I like Vue because it makes things really, really simple to get from I have nothing, or I have a really dumb website, and I just want to add some functionality to it. So if you're looking to make a massive web app, Vue can do that too. Vue has a bunch of libraries and components and those sorts of things which will make it a competitor to React. But in this workshop, I'm not going to be framing it as a competitor to React. I'm going to be framing it as the easiest way to get started on programming. So what is Vue? In case you didn't read the event description or have no idea, that's fine. Vue is a web framework, which basically means that instead of you having to deal with writing JavaScript yourself or writing raw HTML yourself, Vue helps you do that. It helps you do things like, if I want to request some data from a web server periodically and then have it update my website all the time, it makes it significantly easier to do that. If you want to do something like even just having the data on a website, making a simple calculator, those sorts of things, Vue makes that so much easier. I stole this from the Vue website because it's probably better to let them explain it to you why it's so great than me. But basically, I think it's the simplest way that you can get into web programming. It's really, really adoptable, which means like if you've already got a website and it doesn't use Vue, it's really quick to put Vue into it. And it's also very fast, which is another useful thing. Maybe you don't care about that so much right now, but if in 6 months' time your website becomes really popular, it becomes really useful to have a very fast website. So what are Vue's competitors? Obviously there's a longer list here, there's Angularjs, there's other things. I've sort of picked the two big pillars of the web programming community. jQuery, which is about 10 years old and is sort of the old style of how we would do programming, and then React, which I'm sure is what other people might say is the best HTML sort of framework around. So Vue's kind of it's very much like React, except it's much simpler. React gives you a lot of the idea of components, which Vue also has, but it forces you to use a lot of design patterns that are really useful, that are really good at making large web apps. But if you're making something smaller, if you're making something, for instance, for a hackathon or a personal project, you might not need all of that power and all that complexity. jQuery, on the other hand, is basically JavaScript, but with a little bit of extra functionality. It turns out that as JavaScript grows and grows, it's just getting back a lot of the functionality that jQuery once had. And had we been building a web server in 2005, I'm sure I would have been telling you all to use jQuery. Given it's 2019, jQuery is now not used as much. So Vue sits in the middle, and I think it's perfect for students to learn, or if you want to have a personal project, or even if you've already got a website and you want to add some flair to it. So the other thing is, I got a question at the start of this talk, do I need to install anything? The answer is no. If you are dealing with most JavaScript packages, especially for instance React, you would need to install npm and node, which are all these great tools which let you have effectively packages. Almost like installing your own program, but instead of installing a program, it's installing a script that does something cool. Now npm is great, and it's really interesting to learn, but it's also a hassle. And if you want to get something going fast, and you want to get something going with a minimum of friction, you don't even need to use it. And that's what I'm going to try and show you here. If you're interested in doing something a little bit more complex, if you're interested in doing something a little bit more cool, Look into NPM, look into how you can use Vue with NPM. I'm not going to cover that as much here. Cool. So now setup. I had envisioned that there was going to be one command which I was going to use to set up this whole workshop. Unfortunately, that one command does not work for some strange reason, but I have a workaround. I've stolen Carmen's login, so this is not my login, which is perfect because it means I'm not doing any trickery on you. So let's just remove whatever I put in here. Don't need to do that one. All you're going to need to do, type in CP space this thing space setup view. I'll make the terminal a bit bigger, in fact. Or I can't do that. So CP space this thing space setup view.
Is there an external one that you've not looked into CSE for? Or?
If you're not logged into CSE, then you can download the script, I suppose.
Okay.
By going to, I mean, that's hosted on my web directory, so you can pull that down. But it does a lot of LNing, so it might not work all the time. What this is going to do, if anyone has any troubles, shoot up your hand so I know. CSE actually lets you host a web server by yourself. So I have my own little world set up under web.csc tilde 52060. So that's my web address. You all have your own, and it's basically web.csc.unsw.edu.au/the squiggly line thing, and then your ZID. With this command, once you've done that CP command, you should have a file called setup view. If you just go /setup view, so I'll do that now. Copy that in, /setup view. What's going to happen is you'll get a nice little folder in your home directory called public HTML. And this folder, you can dump whatever you want into it, and now you've got a website. And that website is hosted by CSE. Obviously, don't do anything stupid with it. If you want to set up Silk Road 2.0, I wouldn't do it on CSE servers. Probably not. But now what you've got is you've got public HTML/view/ a bunch of HTML files. This is what we're going to be working off in order to do some really cool things with Vue today. People are having trouble setting it up, let me know. I'm very happy to stop for a second and try and get things working. But you should be able to, at this point, if everything is set up nicely, go to web.csc.unsw.edu.au, go to your address, so I believe Carmen is 526.0927, and then go into Vue, and you'll have your own web directory. These are all the files that are in the directory. This is also written using Vue, and we'll show you how to do this in a second. But basically, this is kind of what we're going to cover today. People succeeding. Try and go to your own URL and marvel in the fact that you are now a web developer and can get paid $100,000 a year to write some code. Cool. Awesome. At that point then, let's jump into programming. So the first thing that I kind of want to do is show you what I would have written if I was trying to build a simple web app about 6 months ago. And certainly this is what it would have looked like to build a web app 5 or 10 years ago. So I've got my own Vue folder set up here. And if we look into it, I've got this file, the old ways. The old ways is the old way of doing things. So this is normal HTML. I'm hoping that people have seen that sort of stuff before. We've got our usual header tags with a bunch of imports. We've imported some scripts. We've imported Bootstrap. We go down a bit. We've got a nice little container which contains the title, contains a little pre-formatted area, which is where we're going to put some text in a second, contains an import with a little bit of text, and also contains a button that lets us make a request. Then contains a JavaScript function, which we've written down at the bottom. I'll talk about that in a second, and that's the end of the file. Let's see what that looks like. If we go into the old ways, this is what that looks like. Title, this is a bit of pre-formatted code, massive old input bar, and then a request button. What this does is if we copy in a URL, for instance, I'm going to copy in the URL of this site for itself, you press request. Oh, not happy. It's broken. which is fun. This is the problem with live coding. I'll show you what should happen if this runs. I'll go to here. If we type in this hit request, we should be able to see a big massive list of basically what is in this file. So it's just a simple web request that we're doing. Now this is really useful if you want to test out some API. For instance, I've written my own little API here that you can go to by going view/server. Nope. And this is what it would look like, but if we go to it in here, we can jump over there, circle, server, request, and we get this nice little web API here. So had we been using this HTML here, first of all, it's broken, so it's clearly worse. But more importantly, what we've had to do here is we've written a function that gets the element that contains this text, has this ID. So look for this API URL input field here, get its value, and then have a button that calls a function, and then that function is going to go in, get the value, and then do a request to the internet, and then set some things HTML. So you might ask, well, this looks pretty simple. Why do we care about this? We care about it because what we're doing here is doing a web request and then trying to make some text and then putting the text into our program. But that step in the middle of putting the text together makes it really clunky and makes it really hard to maintain. If I wanted to make an entire web app this way, there'd be a lot of strings that have weird code in the middle of it. It wouldn't be easy to read. So this is where a framework comes in. Instead of having to deal with this sort of, oh, I've got my field and I'm going to get the value out of it, do some processing, and then put it back into it, Vue lets us declare, go down a bit, that I will just like whatever is in the variable data, I just like that to be there. That's what I want. And then, further down a little bit, I can say, see this input form here? I'd like whatever's typed into this input form to be equal to the variable URL. So, if I jump into here now, I'm going to pull up what's called the Vue developer tools, which just shows you a little bit of extra information. We pull it up. We can see that now I've got three variables, a variable called data, a variable called isError, which we'll talk about later, and the URL variable. But note that if I start to change this thing here, this URL variable is automatically changing. So we've got this sort of direct link between an input field and a variable. Now, if we wanted to do this with normal JavaScript, what we'd have to do is we'd have to have some property on this field that said every time I change a thing, please go and change this variable as well. But Vue handles that all for us. So it's really expressive. We get to just say, I would like this field to be equal to this variable, I would like this piece of HTML to be equal to this variable, and so forth. You get this really nice correspondence. So, we'll come back to this example in a second. This is sort of the promise of what's to come. But first of all, I want to go into the simplest possible example and dive deep into it. This is a form, effectively. And whatever I type in here, hello world, can't type right now, comes up in this text field. They're automatically linked. Now, if I wanted to write JavaScript, I'd probably have to write 10 lines of JavaScript to get that to work. If I wanted to do it with Vue, it's really simple. All I need to say is, first of all, I would like whatever's in the text variable to appear inside this field. And then down here you say, well, this input here should correspond to the variable text. And now, whenever I change this field here, it's changing the variable text, and this bit of text up here automatically gets updated as well. Does that make sense? People following? Are there any questions that I can answer at this point? Cool, okay. So then the only other thing that we need to do is just tell this web page to use Vue. So we've got this little script down the bottom, and all it says is, I'd like you to create a new Vue instance, to start running Vue effectively. And you're going to start running it at this place called L. So L is this div here called Vue, and it's kind of the container for everything. So this contains our little variable here, and it also contains the input. And then you also declare some starting data. So For instance, I've got this text variable up here and I'm setting it there, but it's initially equal to some piece of data. And if I wanted to refresh, it goes back to being equal to some piece of data. So with about 5-7 lines of HTML, of JavaScript, we've written a really hard to write program in JavaScript. We haven't had to think about, oh, well, which element is where and getting value and getting text out and putting text back in. All we're saying is this field or this place should have this value. So it's really quite nice and expressive. So this is all well and good, but it's not particularly useful because what if we want to actually do something with our HTML? This is kind of where we can start to see the power of Vue. I'm going to change this input class to, instead of taking in a text, it's going to take in a number. I'm going to go through here and also change that to be equal to num. We'll go up here and change this to be equal to num. And then here we'll change this to be equal to null. And we'll change that there so it says 0. So now, if we save this, we go back in. Now we've got a number selector. And so we can change the number, and again, it's really simple. We change this here, it changes up there. But now we can start to do more interesting things. We've got a number here, so we can do math on it. And I'm hoping all of you remember from 1511 or 9021, you were given a variable, the first thing you were probably asked to do is do some maths. +3, and then divide it by 2, for instance. So if we do this, and let me refresh. Oh, didn't save it. That'll be why. Refresh. We're doing really simple maths already. And again, it kind of makes more sense that we've written the equation right where it's going to be. We've written that num plus 3 is divided by 2. We've written that right exactly where that result is going to come out. So already, we've got this even more powerful system. We're not just saying, well, I've got this number, or I've got this piece of text. We're doing a calculation with it. So we're kind of turning HTML almost into a programming language. We're saying, well, instead of this just being raw text, I'd like this to be some variable, to be some value, and I want to be able to change it however I wish. Already with this, you could make a calculator. You could get in a few inputs with a few text fields, and you could then add up num1 plus num2, do an addition. You could then probably have a drop-down that should type in what operation you wanted, and you'd be able to write a pretty convincing small calculator program just with that input. Yeah. But that's not far enough, obviously, because the next thing that we learn in a programming course is if statements. So instead of dealing with just a number, we'll go back to dealing with a string. And now what I want to do is I want to play a guessing game. So I'm going to guess some text here. Oh, didn't change back to a number. There we go. So this guessing game is really, really simple. If I type in the word hello, I'd like it to show me a message saying, congratulations, you won. And if I type in anything else, I'd like, let's say we'll have another message come up that says, you didn't guess it yet. So we'll put in the sort of HTML for that. So we'll put in a div tag, it's called an alert with alert danger. So this is just creating a little bit of text that's going to come up nicely and show us you guessed wrong. And then we'll also have another one, success, you guessed right. Now at this point, both of them are going to come up. But what we want to have happen is to check whether or not, well, did we get the right piece of data or did we get the wrong piece of data? So, I'm going to go in here. And as an additional property of this div, Vue lets us do something called a VIF. Now VIF is exactly the same as me saying if in JavaScript or in C even. And inside of it is a little expression. So I can put something like if text is not equal to hello. And then if I save it, actually we'll set that to be equal to hello. We'll change this to be guessed right. Change that. success. What's it going? Cool. So, save. Now we're only showing one of the fields. And if we add both a v-if to both of them, we can say, well, v if equals text is not equal to hello. Sorry?
You can change the other one to danger, right?
Ah, yes.
But it's success and no one should be no success.
I do indeed. But two of the same thing. So that's equal to hello, and then this one should be a danger. That says you guessed wrong. That's what happens when you program on your feet. Cool. So now, if we type in hello, it says we guessed right. If we type in anything else, it says we guessed wrong. With this, you can add in even more functionality. I'm hoping you're already thinking of things like, I've got a calculator, maybe I can add in a message that only appears some of the time. I could add in different messages for different calculations. But VF doesn't just work on divs on pieces of text. You can also put a VF on anything. So for instance, I could put a VF on my input and have it only appear some of the time. So with VF, we can already write some pretty expressive programs. And note here that we didn't have to do anything in the JavaScript. We didn't have to talk about, well, if this thing is true, then set some property of visible or invisible. It's already done for us. All we need to do is just specify the condition for which something will appear or won't appear. Does that make sense? People feeling, who already thinks that Vue is more useful than just plain JavaScript? Some people.
Bar's low.
The bar is very low, that's a good point. Is anyone feeling confused or wants me to go over anything? Because this is effectively like learning a new programming language. And in fact, if you haven't seen JavaScript before, it is learning a new programming language. But Vue is pretty simple to pick up on because it has all of these things that we're already used to. We're already used to if statements. We're already used to saying, I want this thing to be equal to this variable. Cool. So, the next thing that I want to do then is take this program that we've already written. I'm going to come back to it and talk about it a little bit more. This is our web API program. So we'll jump in here. What it should do is it should take a URL, paste it in there, we ask for it, and we see whatever that request returns. So in this case, this is the source code of this page. If I wanted to type in a server, then I could type in server, for instance, make a request. And there we go. We can see that request. Perfect. What we're doing here though, as I explained a second ago, we actually have to actively set the values of those things, and every time things change, we have to change things around. So I suppose the next thing that might be useful is to talk about, well, how can we convert a piece of code that's written with JavaScript into a piece of code that's written with Vue? And I kind of want to step through the exercise. And if you've set it up on your own computers, I'd encourage you to follow along and actually type it out. Because I think you'll find that typing is already quite useful for learning things. But as well as that it feels pretty natural what we're about to do. It's going to make sense, I suppose. So the first thing that we're going to do is get rid of all the things we don't care about anymore. So we don't actually really care about this. Actually, what we might do first is we'll put in the new world, and then we'll take out the old one. So let's open up that Vue playground that we had a second ago. We're just going to copy and paste in this Vue model, because copying and pasting is what we're good at as programmers. Paste that in.
Sorry.
Is there a question? Oh, no, cool. So we've set up this new Vue instance. We may also need to go back and actually create a thing called a Vue. So we'll set this div to be our big container, and it will contain Vue. Perfect. And now we're also going to set this to be equal to, what do we call it up there? What do we get from our web API? Cool. So now we've got this Vue instance, and we've just got to implement it. We've just got to make it actually work. which doesn't seem too hard. Maybe, we'll see. So, the first thing that I want to do is I want to make that this section here, that before we were setting manually, we just want to make this thing be equal to whatever we've got down there. So for instance, down there we've got text. So we'll go back up here and set this to text. Cool. The next thing we want to do is, well, we're going to need to set up this function down here so that it actually get rid of this. Cool. So here's this searching function. I'll talk about exactly what it's doing in a moment, but we'll manipulate it first and then we can sort of understand it from that. Instead of this being a function in its own right, we're going to move it as to be a method of the Vue instance. So the Vue instance basically has its own functions rather than just being a generic JavaScript function. It's a part of this particular Vue instance now. So we'll go methods and we'll put in the middle what do we call it? Update data. And this is just a function that's going to do everything that we did in here. So we can copy all of this stuff. But one of the things we might notice is that we've still got the old world style of, well, I want to go to this particular place and get the value of that place. But now that we're in Vue land, we don't even need to worry about, well, do I need to go to a particular place and get the URL? I can create a piece of data called the URL. I can make it equal to blank to start with. And then I can make this input be the model of that URL. So what we've just done here is now we've created a new piece of data that's contained by the Vue instance, and we're saying that piece of data, every time we change this input here, I want it to change that piece of data. And now, we don't even need to worry about this const URL business here. We can just go this.url. So every time we change the URL, it's going to change the Vue instance. And every time and then whenever we call this function, that Vue instance is going to run this function with that URL. It might be a good idea at this point to stop for a moment and explain exactly what this code does. Who here has done JavaScript programming before with REST or JSON or those sorts of things? I'm assuming not many people. Perfect, okay. Beginner audience, that's perfect. So, what we're using here is this program called Axios. It's not built into JavaScript. It's like if you hash included something in C. And Axios is basically a nice web library. And so let's just say axios.get and then a URL. So in this case, it's whatever URL we typed in. And it will return us a response from that URL, which has something like a response.data. And so that's saying, well, I want you to, it's just like me saying, open up my web browser, go into the web browser and type in a URL, and then copy the contents of that web browser into a file. And then get at that file and show me what was in that file. So we've got this GET request here, and now we're saying, instead of us saying, well, I want to set the error text and I want to set the API text to whatever, I can just go this dot text equals response.data. So already we've got rid of this concept of like, where am I putting the data? All we're doing is we're filling up a variable. And just for the moment, we'll ignore this error function. Let's just assume that our code always works, which it always does in my case. Touch wood. Is there anything left to do? The only thing left is that instead of having this search API function, no longer are we calling out this function. We're calling something inside the Vue instance. So we have this idea of what we call a v on. On click equals what's it called? Update data. Hopefully I've gotten that all right. Let's just just double check against what I've already written. All we need to do is go into here where I've already written the import. We'll copy it across, paste it in there, close that. So now, not only have we imported Axios, we've also imported Vue.js. Hopefully now it will tell us that Vue is actually defined. And there we go. We can take this and see whether it works or not. It's very risky. Happens. Dot, dot, dot. Dot, dot, dot. Just going to go through. Let's have a look. Update that. Let's try again. This is the bad side of live programming. Sometimes something goes wrong. That request didn't go through. So this is a bit of debugging that we've got to do now. Why didn't this actually work? The reason that this didn't work is because of one other little JavaScript problem. Now, you'll hear me bash JavaScript a few times. Vue makes JavaScript a lot better, but there's a few weird things that sometimes happen. In this case, this is a JavaScript problem where you need to type in bind this. You can literally copy this as boilerplate, but what this is saying is this function inside of here doesn't actually know what the Vue object is. So we then say bind this, and it now knows what the Vue object is. So we'll go back and see if that fixes it. Paste that in. There we go. Cool. So now we've got a working program. And there are two reasons why I show you this. The first one is because getting a little bit of the feel of how you actually type out a Vue program is always nice. But also because if you've got any code already that you see, or you see in one of your companies that you work for, or you're working with one of your friends on something, you can say, hey, look at this JavaScript code. It's not actually too much effort. It took us 10 minutes to go from JavaScript code to Vue code. So I had to do this exercise personally. When I first found Vue, I had a large program that was written using normal JavaScript, no frameworks. And it was a pain in the ass to deal with. You had to, every time you wanted to add a new feature, you'd have to type out the HTML inside of a string, and then append that string in the right place. And it was unmaintainable. I used Vue, and yes, there was a little time to rewrite it, but once it was rewritten, adding features is really fast. Because all you need to do is just say what data you would like to have, and then say where the data needs to go, and it's all written for you. So, we've written this. Perfect. Are there any questions about that? Did anyone manage to get that working while I was talking on their own computers? I'm curious. Interesting, okay. That's a perfectly good exercise if you'd like to take it home and look at the code which is now here, which you can see by typing in the URL and having a look at that URL. You can try and follow converting the JavaScript we've already got into this view. Cool. The next thing that I want to talk about is a little bit of a diversion from actual Vue and talk about two problems that this code has. The first one is, what if I try and go to a website that doesn't work? At the moment, nothing will change, but we should get an error that says, it's all junk that's coming up. Try again. So go to nonexistent.com. Request. Nothing happens. And if we're writing our own program, we'd clearly like to have something happen. So let's go into here again, and we'll add something for that. We've got this function that's really, really quick, and it just says we'll take this response and chuck in whatever the data was that we got from it. I'm going to add something in that catches an error. So if we make a call to a somewhere and it doesn't actually exist, what we can do is we'll add in a thing called this.has or error message, and we'll set that to be equal to this request did not work, and then we can add in error.response.message, I believe. And this is all documented in the Axios site, so you can find out where all of these things are. and we'll set this.text to this didn't work, or even make it simple, we'll just set this.text equal to that. And now, if we make a request to nonexistent.com, hopefully, we also need to try. This is one of the annoying things about JavaScript. Everywhere you go, you'll find this problem, and you have to fix it. Bind to this. Hopefully now, I'll make the request. This request did not work. I'm guessing it's not the right message. Error.message, I assume. Cool. And it says request failed with status code 404. For those of you who haven't played with HTML before, 404 means that you couldn't find the page. So that already, we've gone from having a function that wouldn't handle failure, and in one line, we've made it handle that failure. The other trick that I'll mention, if you haven't programmed with HTML and JavaScript before, you might not know about this little thing called the CrossOrigin Request policy. Sounds really technical. People who have seen it before are just like, oh god. Basically what this says is to make the web more secure, I, as web.cse.unsw.edu.au, can't request to google.com. I can't go across to ask a question to another website. If we try and do that here, we try and see, well, hey, what does the Google API look like? Google.com. We get this message here. And again, it'll say this request did not work because of a network error, which is kind of nice of them to give us that message. But it'll also say that didn't work. The reason I mention that is because sadly JavaScript has its limitations, that's one of them. But usually there's a way to get around it. If you want to get data from another website, you just need to have a server as well that you've written. For instance, I've written my server here, so I could have, if I go to this place and go to server, there we go. I could have this return some request that I made to Google, and I've sort of got a middleman, so I go through the server to Google and back again. Cool. So let's go through next to, after we've learned if statements and we've learned variables in programming language, the next thing that we invariably learn is while loops. Vue doesn't actually technically have while loops, it's got for loops, but they work basically the same. And the best example I have for that is index.html. So what I've got here is a list of responses, and I haven't typed these out with 6 different things. I've written it once and then said, hey Vue, every time you see a thing in a list, just put a matching line in this list of files. So let's take a look at how that works. So, here we go. So instead of writing a bunch of JavaScript code to say, oh, I would like you to put in this list of different files, all I need to do is say, hey Vue, I've got this tag, an A tag, which is a link tag, and I'd like you to do it every time there's a file in files to make the place where it's pointing to file.href, and to make its name file.name. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense until you've seen what the actual structure of that thing looks like. So let's make a call to see what it looks like. So wait a second for it to process. Again, doing things live, always the best idea. Here we go. So what I'm doing with my for loop now, I've gone to this website and I've said I'd like a list of all the files that are in my directory. The website has returned, well, here's the list of all the files in the directory, and it gives me this list of, well, here's the first file, it's got an href of this thing, this is the URL, and it's got this name as well. And it does that for the 7 files that are in this directory. you'll note that if you've got a copy on your own computer, you've also got those 7 files. And if you add your own in, I believe it will update with what it shows for in your directory. So let's now have a look at this a bit closer. We've already seen most of this before. We've seen that we've got this Vue element. We've seen it's inside a Vue container. It's got this piece of data called files, which is the list. It's an empty list at this point. The only interesting thing is now we've got this mounted function. Now the mounted function basically says, I've got this HTML file. When it loads, run this program. So in this case, it'll run axios.get this server, and then it'll set all of the files in my Vue instance to whatever the server returns me back. It's the simplest program you could possibly have, because it's just it runs once. You press reload, and it'll call out to the server and get a list of files back. Are there any questions about how that works? Are there any questions about anything? I can stop it for a second and ask. People following. Silence, okay. So, what we've got here, now we've got this function which basically says, whenever you start up this website, then set the Vue instance's files to be equal to whatever I get returned back. And now up here, we introduce this new idea called a v4. v4 says, if files is an array, go through every single element in that array. For each of them, make one of these tags, and then inside of it, you can write things like file.name. And that's saying, back here, file.name would have been 6. 6 is borrowing. And so that will appear there. And then perhaps up here, we also want to make it a URL, a link. So we need to put in what where it links to. And in that case, that's this href. And the link is here as href. So we just go in and say, well, I would like this to link to this place. And if you look at it, what happens? It's, after a second, you load up this. And we've got this list of different things. We've got a list of all of the files in my directory. Things you could do on your own from this point. Well, now you've got for loops, you could write your own to-do list app, effectively. Which is one of the things I was planning to do, but I don't think we'll have time to get to it today. This server supports writing a to-do app. You can go to view/server/todos. And it's got this little database, it's got a little endpoint. There are no to-dos at the moment, but you can figure out how to make your own to-dos, submit them, and then the server will store that for you. And then you can list them back out. I'll include instructions after this workshop on how to do that if we don't get time to do it ourselves. Cool. So let's jump back to the playground, for instance. 0 playground. Cool. So where we already had this really simple program that was a guessing game, now I'm going to type in multiple guesses. I'm going to separate them with a comma, and it will be able to see multiple different boxes, each of which is going to contain whether that guess was right or wrong. Seems even more complicated, but Vue is going to make it pretty simple to do. So let's jump into that. So instead of having this if, I'm going to just have one of it, and I'm going to wrap it around another div that's a div v4, and that v4 we'll come back to in a second, but we'll just set it up first. Cool. So this is going to be for every possibility, well, actually let's call it text, in, we'll jump down here, and we'll set this to say guesses. So we'll have this list of guesses here, go back up here, and we'll have a piece of guesses there, and we'll make this a model for guesses. So we've just gone through and changed every reference of where it says text to guesses. And now up here, we can have for text in guesses, And in fact, we kind of want to split it up individually. So if we wanted to learn how to do that, we'd look up on JavaScript, split string JavaScript. Conveniently, there's this split function. You'll notice that all of these links are purple because one of the great things about JavaScript is that it looks a lot like every other programming language, but it's not quite. So a lot of the time you'll go and Google something for exactly how to do it. But what this is doing, given some string, we type in .split and then delimiter. So let's say that we do .split and then our delimiter is comma. Now, this will go through this string called guesses. It'll go through each part of it, and it will say, I would like you to print this out. So now we can put back in this and say equals your guess, and then we'll chuck it in, text is wrong, and then your guess text was right. And again, we'll change this back to success, and we'll go back into status space in there so it'll make it easier to split things up. Let's see what happens now. Maybe things will work. Well, guesses. So my guesses was wrong. But what about if I guessed goodbye? That was wrong too. How about if I guess hello? Oh. Spelling mistake there. I'm going to have two braces. There we go. So now, I've got this web app that not only is going to be able to tell me whether my guess was right or wrong, but it can also do that for multiple guesses. Something else I might want to do, for instance, is have my guess that's, I don't know, let's say that I wanted to have a list of elements in an array that was returned to me by a server. I could v4 through that, go through the JSON object, and say, well, for each element, well, was my guess that was returned from the server right or wrong? Again, it's pretty simple. All we've got is this v4 element here, and it's just saying this v4, go through each thing in this list, and for each one of them, if the thing is equal to hello, then show it was wrong, or not equal to hello, sorry, show it was wrong, and if the thing is equal to hello, then show it was right. Are there any questions about that? Yes?
Is all the text that's inside the like v4 and vif, is that like JavaScript?
Yes, so it's full JavaScript, yes.
Yeah, okay.
But you may notice that it looks a lot like every other programming language you've ever seen. If you've seen Python, it looks similar to that. If you've seen C, it doesn't look so similar to that, but this part probably does, maybe. So yeah, you can write in a full JavaScript function and check some really complicated property of your text. You can check whatever you'd like, and then you can just put in a little bit of JavaScript here to say, well, if that function's true, show this thing. If it's not, then don't. Yeah? So if you already know JavaScript, it's very powerful. But if it's not that much of an extra leap of faith to be like, well, if this is how I write this thing in JavaScript, let's put it into a VF here. Cool. So the next thing that I want to talk about, after we've done ifs and fors, JavaScript has this great property called a local storage, which lets us remember things across refreshes. I'll show an example of that. Yeah, we'll go to for, do one, and we'll go by here. It's easier to click. So at the moment, it's saying the data I requested is null, because there's nothing in there. But let's say that I type in hello world, right? If we'd been on any other page that we've already seen, that would just disappear. But if I refresh now, hello world stays. Now, that by itself isn't a Vue thing, that's a JavaScript thing. But the way that Vue does this is really, really elegant, and I quite like it, so I'll show it to you all now. We'll jump back into the playground, and we'll type something up. So we've got this guesses string here, and if I type blah into it, and I refresh, well, it didn't work and it's not going to stay there. So let's jump into, perfect. And now, we'll go down to the Vue instance. Now remember, just from a second ago to revise, we had EL, which is the big element that contains everything inside the Vue. We've got data, which is our list of all of the guesses that we had. I am going to add 3 lines, or 5 lines actually, and we'll be able to store it permanently. The first thing that I want to do is I want to, instead of just at the start setting guesses to be equal to guesses, I'm going to need to get it from memory. And the way that I do that is by going window.localstorage.getItem guesses. So, at the moment there's nothing stored in guesses, clearly, so this is not going to work properly. But the moment that we put something in local storage, we can get it back out. Now the question is, well, how do we put it into local storage? You might think, well, maybe we should have something up here that puts it into local storage. The issue is that the only constructs that we've got up here are for loops and ifs. There's not really a good way of putting something into code. So we've got to put it down here. And Vue has this concept of a watcher. A watcher is like, every time this variable changes, run this function. If you've played with JavaScript before, it's a lot like the onChange function, but it's a lot more powerful because it lets you deal with the Vue object's data. So every time guesses changes, for instance, I can do something automatically with that. So we'll put in watch, and now we're going to say, well, we're going to watch guesses. And then whenever guesses changes, this function will get called, and we just say window.localstorage.setItem guesses to be this.guesses. I'm hoping that by itself, when you see a blank screen like this, you know that something's gone wrong. Let's have a look what the error was. Saying error in render guesses is null. So that's because we haven't actually set it in the first place. I believe the easiest way to fix that is if getItem has a second argument that is basically the default. So if guesses isn't there, then get whatever is in this string. If I refresh now, no, don't want to do that. Do it the other way. So this is a bit of JavaScript notation that basically says, if getItem guesses doesn't work, then just return the empty string. I believe there is a getItem default, but I'm not going to go looking for it. Cool. So now we've got this empty string. That's kind of annoying. What if I want to set something inside of it? I want to set guess hello. Cool. Oh, I'll change it to lowercase. Now, moment of truth. Before, if I refreshed this, it would have said guess again, and it would have gone away. If I refresh now, it stays there. That's pretty cool. So what actually happened? Well, we added in this piece of data, and whenever we refresh, the first thing that it sees is whatever is inside getItem, or inside local storage, sorry. And the thing that it will then do every time we change is set the item inside local storage. So it's sort of linked up local storage and this variable. So every time the variable changes, it will change local storage. And then every time we refresh, the variable will get set to whatever's inside local storage. Yes?
Where is local storage?
So local storage is a property of the browser. And basically every page has its own local storage, which is why you're saying window.local storage, because it's inside my particular window there's this concept of local storage. And it persists across whenever you refresh. Even if you close your browser, it will still stay there. So it's really useful for things like, if I've chosen some options in a game or I've chosen some options on a website, I can put them into local storage and I'll never forget them. And I'll come back to the website in a month's time and they'll still be there.
Or even if you flush your cookies and
If you flush your cookies and you start playing around with things, then no. Obviously it's not impervious to, like if you destroy the computer, they're not going to stay there. But it will stay around for long enough that it's pretty useful if you want to go back tomorrow and see the same thing there. So even if I go away and come back and then refresh, it'll still stay there. Cool. Any questions about that? Awesome. The other thing that I'll talk about in this moment is this other thing called a computed property. Computed properties kind of remind me of watchers, because instead of a watcher being like, every time you see something happen, do this thing, it says, every time I try and access this this computed property, calculate what it's supposed to be equal to. It's kind of like having a function that acts like a property. So let's go in here, we'll add one, computed, and it's going to be, so return, so computed, and then that, open that, and that there. Inside of here, we're going to have a computed property called list of guesses. And this is going to return list.guesses.split space. And now, up here, first of all, we can replace this sort of list that we had here with the actual list that we're using. So list of guesses. Missing comma. This is what happens if you forget a comma there. One comma and all breaks. But now, we're seeing this nice list of what all my guesses were. Even better, we can go up here to where we had text and guesses.split, and we can change that to be list of guesses. And it'll just keep working. So the reason that was so useful is because now we can have a variable that we change here, and every time I change this variable to add something else, we still keep this list, and we don't have to write out .split blah 50 times. We've just written this property, and that property keeps on going, or keeps changing. Any questions about properties or anything so far? Yes?
Could you just say what the compute property did again?
Yeah, so computed properties, it's a function. It looks a lot like a variable, and every time I reference it in my Vue code, for instance, here, it looks like I'm talking about a variable called list of guesses, but what it's actually doing is asking this function, what is the value of this variable, every time you call it. They're useful particularly in cases where you've either got a really complicated function with a bunch of function calls, and you don't actually want to write the function again. You can just write a computed property for it. They're also useful for things like, well, let's say that I wanted to now add in hello world here. So I'm always guessing hello world. Don't know why you want to do that. Oh. Because we'll do this from the other side. This dot guesses plus hello world. So the brackets. Hopefully that will work. There we go. And so now, even though I haven't written it down there, yes, hello world comes up as one of my guesses. Again, useful because instead of having to express a composition of variables inside my code, or express it as a function, I now just have my own variable that's equal to a bunch of other things put together. Comes up quite often. Cool. The last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of actual code is one of the features of Vue that might get talked about a lot more in React and other component-based systems as well, which is basically that I can be really lazy and say, there are programmers who are better than me, who have written some tool that is better than what I can write, and so I can just use their program instead. The perfect example of this is here. This dropdown, I did not write. It took me 2 lines of code to make this dropdown, but it's got all these fancy features like, oh, it faded in, and I can click 3 things and it'll show them all there. If I wanted to write that myself, it'd be like a few hundred lines of JavaScript and it'd probably be broken. But this is 2 lines of code. How is it 2 lines of code, you might ask? Well, I was actually in this situation where I was looking for a multi-selector, exactly like this. So I go into Google, and I'm like, Vue, multi-select. Oh look, the first result is this nice web page. we go in here. Ooh, it's very pretty and it shows us this is exactly what I want. I scroll down. Oh look, it's just like an import. I go script this thing, import the style sheet, copy it into my own program. So if we go in here, we'll go into 6. I copied this multi-select into here. And now inside my program, I can just say multi-select. Just like it was another element. Just like it was an input or it was a paragraph or whatever, I can say multi-select. And it's a multi-select that deals with a list of options here. So in this case, the list of options is all of the here. The list of options is all of the pages in my directory. But it also updates this V model of selected options. So if I choose these two, if we go into my panel here, we can see that selected options is an array with 3 elements. It's an array with, let's have a look. It's got this first element, which is the one we saw before with that name and that link. It's got 2 other elements that look exactly the same. So I haven't written any of this code. All I've done is I've just said, I would like a multi-select that takes this list of options, puts the selected options that the user chose into selected options, and then do some other stuff as well. So you can choose only one, and you can choose multiple. You can set some other variables on it and stuff, which you can look up. But it was 2 lines of code for me to write this. It was just an input. One other trick is you've got there's one other line of code you have to put in here. Again, copy-paste from the documentation. If we go into the documentation here, it says basic usage via CDN. Just copy that line in. So what you'll find is that if you're looking for something in a particular area, you're looking for something from Vue, you can copy and paste this sort of few lines of code and use the code that someone else has written. As I said in the names of my files, it's not cheating, it's borrowing. Please don't quote me on that one. So, again, this is just another example, but now I'm using my own data. I've written option 1 and option 2, and I can check, well, did the user select option 1, and did they select option 2? Perfect. Are there any questions about that? Does that not make sense to anyone? Anything people are curious about? Okay, awesome. I'll talk a bit now about what's next from here. Obviously, the next thing that you can go and do is write your own Vue program. I would suggest to you that you use the starter files that I put in your directory. I should publish these, hopefully, so you'll be able to find them. I believe that there is a subdirectory of yours called Vue/complete, I think it's called. Yeah, Vue/complete. If you go to your own website here, so z5 whatever, /Vue/complete, after this presentation, I'll put all of the files that I wrote there, and you'll be able to go and access them yourself. The things that you should probably do from here, try and write your own code that does exactly this. Do a calculator, do a to-do list. Write your own website that just says hello world. You've got all of the tools that you need now, everything's set up in your home directory hopefully, so that you're able to go in and make your own website, make your own stuff. If you're going to the hackathon on Saturday, I'm sorry, I won't be there personally, but if you go along, you'll be able to find people there who know what they're doing. You'll be able to write your own Vue app pretty quickly, and you can use all of these techniques here and copy and paste from the code I just gave you, and you'll be able to make a very functional web app in no time at all. You'll notice that throughout this presentation, I was doing a lot of copying and pasting. That's because it's already on the internet. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. All you need to do is just say, well, this is some code here, copy paste. Cool. If you're really interested in this stuff and you want to go further, you can look into NPM, which is the Node package manager. It will let you do some more complicated things with Vue. It will let you install other packages. It will let you